They thought she was just another rancher's wife, a quiet, unassuming woman in her 50s, tending to the day-to-day chores of the ranch. Her husband, Robert, had inherited the sprawling property from his family, and together they lived a simple life in the heart of Montana's rugged countryside. It was peaceful, serene even, a far cry from the violence and danger that lurked in the shadows of the world. But they were wrong, so wrong, and that mistake would cost them dearly. On a warm spring morning, the Devil's Mayhem Motorcycle Club made their move, targeting the one thing they thought was vulnerable, Victoria Kingsley. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. Victoria had been watching them long before they decided to make their presence known. It wasn't paranoia. No, it was instinct. For the past few weeks, she'd noticed the same motorcycle cruising by the property, always at the same time of day, always just a little too close to the border of the ranch. 3 riders, each one with the same patch on their backs. The Devil's Mayhem MC, a ruthless gang with a reputation that stretched across 3 states. They weren't just bikers, they were criminals, and they'd already made their mark on the region, leaving a trail of broken lives and stolen land in their wake. They had their eyes on the Kingsley Ranch. The land was strategic, valuable, and they knew that Robert wouldn't easily sell. So they decided to take another route, one that was as old as time itself: intimidation, kidnapping. The morning they arrived, Victoria knew it was time. She had seen them coming for days. It wasn't about the land for her anymore. It was about something bigger. They had underestimated her, and that was the biggest mistake they could have made. As the roar of the motorcycles approached, Victoria didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this moment, and she was ready. Calmly, she stood on the porch, watching as the 3 bikes pulled up in a V formation, engines revving loudly. The man at the front, the leader, was a familiar face: Vincent Romano, the president of Devil's Mayhem, a former soldier who had turned his skills into building a criminal empire. He wasn't just some biker. He was dangerous, calculating, and most importantly, ruthless. He had made a name for himself, creating a network that stretched far beyond Montana. He was a man who knew how to get what he wanted. But today, he had met his match. Romano killed the engine of his bike and slid off, his 2 enforcers flanking him like wolves, ready to pounce. Victoria stood her ground, her body language deceptively calm, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She wasn't scared. She wasn't even worried. She had been here before, more times than she cared to remember. The life of a federal marshal had taught her to stay cool under pressure, to read people and situations before they could read her. Romano, with all his bravado, wasn't as sharp as he thought. He thought he was intimidating, but all she saw was a man who was about to learn a lesson in humility. "Mrs. Kingsley," Romano said with that sickening charm that criminals always seem to carry, "beautiful day for a ride, wouldn't you agree?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The enforcers behind him shifted slightly, positioning themselves to intimidate. But Victoria wasn't fazed. She had faced far worse in her time. "Private property," she said, her voice polite but firm, not giving an inch. Romano didn't back down. He was too confident, too used to getting his way. "Well, that's exactly what I wanted to discuss, Mrs. Kingsley. You see, my organization has big plans for this region, plans that could benefit everyone, including you and your husband. I'm offering you a deal, one that could solve a lot of problems." He was smooth, but his words were edged with something darker, something that couldn't be ignored. Victoria met his eyes. "We're not interested," she said without hesitation. "This ranch has been in my husband's family for generations. It's not for sale." Romano's smile faltered just for a moment before it returned, but this time it was colder, more calculating. "Things change, Mrs. Kingsley," he said, stepping a little closer. "Smart folks adapt. Others, well, they tend to get left behind, tragically, sometimes." He let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Victoria allowed a flicker of fear to cross her face, just enough to make them think they had the upper hand. She could see it in their eyes. They believed they had her. They thought she was just another rancher's wife, someone who would crumble under pressure. They were wrong. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to make them think they were getting somewhere. Romano's eyes lit up. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he was savoring it. "I'll make you a generous offer," he said smoothly, pulling a card from his jacket. $2 million, well above market value. It's a fair deal, but you need to move fast, Mrs. Kingsley. The offer won't last forever." Victoria hesitated for a moment, pretending to consider his offer, but inside, her mind was already calculating her next move. She knew exactly what he was after. He wanted the ranch, sure, but it wasn't just for the land. It was for the strategic value it held. Canyon Road ran right through the property, an important route for smuggling, for moving illegal goods without drawing attention. It wasn't just a ranch. It was a key piece in the larger operation Devil's Mayhem was running, and Victoria had already been tracking their every move for weeks. "Let me think it over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Romano handed her the card with a flourish, but as his hand brushed hers, Victoria took note of his nervous energy. His men weren't used to real violence. They were just trying to intimidate, and they weren't prepared for what was about to hit them. "Take your time," Romano said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But don't take too long. I'll be back in 3 days for your answer." With that, he turned and mounted his bike, his enforcers following suit. They left, roaring down the gravel driveway, leaving Victoria standing on the porch. She didn't move until the sound of their engines faded into the distance. Then her posture shifted. The trembling stopped. Her hands, which had been shaking from the pressure of the situation, now steadied. Her mind was already working, already putting the pieces together. "They've made their move," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "And now it's time to make mine." Robert emerged from the house, watching her with a look of concern. "Vicky," he said quietly, "this is getting dangerous." Victoria smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth, no kindness. It was the smile of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for years. "Robert," she said, "they've just made their biggest mistake." She turned and looked out over the land, the ranch she had spent so many years protecting. "They think they're in control," she continued, her voice cold and calm, "but they've just walked into my trap." The ghost was back. Victoria knew they weren't just watching anymore. She'd been tracking them for weeks, their movements growing bolder by the day, testing the waters, gauging her response. But today, it wasn't just a few glances across the border of her property. No, today, they were making a statement. The rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance, and for the first time, it wasn't just one bike passing by. It was a full patrol, the unmistakable thrum of Devil's Mayhem's presence filling the air. 3 bikes this time, and the leader was unmistakable, Vincent Romano, the man who had orchestrated this empire of violence, the man who had made a name for himself by crushing anyone who stood in his way, leaving devastation and fear wherever he went. His club, his empire, was built on intimidation, manipulation, and ruthless control. They had already begun marking their territory, inching closer to the Kingsley Ranch, and now it was time to make their move. Victoria was ready, and she'd been preparing for this day for far longer than the bikers could have imagined. As the bikers roared down the gravel road, the sound reverberating through the ranch like a distant storm, she moved with practiced precision, calmly stepping onto the porch. The sun had barely risen, and the soft morning light still lingered on the horizon. To the outside world, she looked like any other rancher's wife, just a woman going about her daily routine. But inside, she was calculating every move, every possible outcome. It wasn't just about keeping the ranch anymore. It was about stopping the storm before it could tear through everything she had built. Robert was already at the window, scanning the horizon with a look of quiet concern. He didn't have the eyes she did. He didn't see the patterns, the tells, the way the bikers were slowly building their presence. But then again, Robert was a rancher, not a hunter. He didn't live his life watching for predators. He was used to dealing with cattle and crops, not the kind of people who operated in the shadows. When Victoria entered the kitchen, he didn't even look up from the tablet he had been scanning, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "They're back," he said softly, his voice laced with frustration, though not surprise. He had learned to read her, and after 10 years of marriage, he knew what was coming. Victoria poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements calm, deliberate, almost mechanical. She didn't rush. The world around her was still, and she made sure her own presence matched it. "Same ones as before?" she asked, her voice as gentle as a spring breeze, but there was an edge to it, one Robert couldn't ignore. Victoria's eyes never left the window as she sipped her coffee. She wasn't just looking out at the road, at the bikes approaching. She was measuring them, calculating angles and distances, mentally placing herself in the perfect position. Every second mattered. Same 3 bikes, different riders, new one on a red Harley. She could see the details with ease. Amateur rider, weight too far forward. Robert set his cup down and looked at her, his eyes narrowing as he finally realized what she was saying. "They're testing us. Again." Victoria's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not the kind of smile that showed warmth or affection, but the kind of smile that had haunted more criminals than she cared to remember. "They're building patterns," she said, setting her cup down on the counter with a soft clink. "Testing our response times, looking for weaknesses." She paused, her eyes flicking briefly to Robert. "Sheriff Dawson's patrols, our delivery schedules, our daily routines. They're watching it all. They'll make their move soon." Robert's eyes darkened. "We could just sell the land and get out before it gets worse." Victoria's gaze sharpened, her calm demeanor giving way to something more resolute. "It's not about the land, Robert." Her voice dropped lower, more serious, almost icy. "They're trying to take control of this entire region. They've already pushed everyone else out. This is the last piece of land they need." She didn't need to elaborate. Robert already knew the stakes. They had been hearing whispers for weeks, rumors about Devil's Mayhem pushing harder, forcing people out, buying up property along Canyon Road. It wasn't just about land anymore, it was about power, and if the bikers took control of the area, there would be nothing left for anyone. "Then why not sell? Why not let them have it?" Robert pressed, his frustration mounting as the sound of the motorcycles grew closer, more insistent. Victoria turned to him, her face softening for just a moment. "Because if we sell, Robert, they win, and I'm not going to let them win, not now, not ever." She didn't wait for a response. The bikes were closer now, and they weren't just passing by this time. They were stopping at the end of the long gravel driveway, turning off the engines with an ominous silence that spoke louder than the rev of their engines ever could. Victoria moved to the window, her stance casual, but inside she was a whirlwind of preparation. She didn't just see the bikers, she saw their mistakes, the gaps in their plan, the ways they had already exposed their intentions. They were uncoordinated, their timing off. The 2 enforcers flanking Romano, though experienced, had already made a critical error. They had spread out, telegraphing their movements, showing their hands too early. 3 bikes, 1 leader, 2 enforcers, a simple enough setup if you didn't know how to read the signs. Romano dismounted from his bike first, his movements smooth, almost theatrical. His 2 enforcers followed suit, scanning their surroundings. Their eyes flicked over the property, sizing it up. They had already underestimated the land, but they had also underestimated the woman standing on the porch, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. Romano flashed her a practiced smile, the kind of smile that criminals use to manipulate and intimidate. "Mrs. Kingsley," he called out, his voice carrying the false charm of a predator. "Beautiful morning for a ride, don't you think?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. She simply smiled back, her tone polite but firm, as though she were speaking to someone who had just overstayed their welcome. "This is private property, Mr. Romano." Romano's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, this time with an edge of something colder. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. You see, my organization has big plans for this region, plans that could benefit everyone, including you and your husband." He made it sound so simple, so easy. The offer of $2 million, far above market value, seemed like a lifeline for a rancher in a tough spot. But Victoria saw right through it. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a trap, a well-crafted trap, designed to make her feel like she had no choice but to give in. But that wasn't going to happen. Not today. Victoria took a step forward, keeping her voice level and steady. "We're not interested," she said. "This ranch has been in my husband's family for generations." Romano's smile slipped slightly, his patience thinning. "Things change, Mrs. Kingsley," he said, his voice turning colder, sharper. "Smart folks adapt. Others, well, they tend to get left behind. Sometimes, tragically." He let the implication hang in the air, a veiled threat that was as old as time itself. But Victoria wasn't fazed. She let her eyes flicker to his enforcers, watching how they subtly moved, trying to flank her, trying to box her in. She noticed the nervous tension in their posture, the way they subtly adjusted their grips on their weapons. It was a classic move, one that only someone with real training would spot, and it told her everything she needed to know. For a brief moment, Victoria let a flicker of fear cross her face. She wanted them to think they were getting to her, to believe they had broken her. But inside, she was already 3 steps ahead. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and as Romano took a step closer, pulling out a business card, Victoria's calm smile returned. "Take some time," he said smoothly, "but not too much. We'll need an answer in 3 days." As the bikers roared off, Victoria stood there, unmoving, watching them leave. It wasn't the first time she'd been threatened, and it wouldn't be the last. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that they had just made their biggest mistake. They thought they were in control, but they had just walked right into her trap. When the engines faded into the distance, Victoria's demeanor changed. The trembling in her hands stopped. Her posture shifted, and her mind began to race. She was already thinking 5 steps ahead, calculating the risks, plotting her next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "They've made their move," she said softly to herself, "and now it's time to make mine." Victoria Kingsley watched the sun rise over the ridge as she sat on the porch, the faint light casting long shadows across the ranch. The day seemed ordinary at first, just another peaceful morning in the countryside, but in her gut, something had shifted. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. She had been preparing for this moment for days, weeks, really, and now the bikers had made their move. Romano and his crew had come to play their hand, believing that they could strong-arm her into giving up the ranch. They didn't realize yet that it wasn't going to be that easy. She could feel the tension rising in the air. For months, she had watched the Devil's Mayhem Motorcycle Club grow bolder. They'd been testing her patience, circling her like wolves, picking at the edges of the land they wanted to take. Victoria knew exactly what they were after. The land wasn't just valuable, it was strategic. It connected key routes, ones that would make it easier for their illegal operations to move undetected. And they weren't going to stop until they had it. But Victoria wasn't about to hand it over, not without a fight. The bikes were coming again. This time, it was more than just a few casual passes. It was a deliberate approach. Romano had learned to make his presence known, a message sent through the rumble of their engines, a threat hidden in the sound of those tires crunching against gravel. She knew what they were about to do. They were closing in. She could hear the motorcyclists before she saw them, their engines revving in a way that shook the very earth beneath her feet. Victoria stood up, her hand instinctively brushing against the worn leather of her jacket, the weight of the years it had seen suddenly heavy on her shoulders. She didn't need to look back to know that Robert was watching from the window, his expression unreadable. He trusted her. He had to. This wasn't the first time trouble had found its way to their door, but it was the first time in a long while that it had come in the form of a motorcycle gang with enough power and ambition to shake the foundations of everything they had built. She wasn't going to let them tear it down. She moved slowly, almost casually, as though it was just another day. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands steady despite the tension building in her chest. As she watched the bikers close in, she let herself focus on the routine of making coffee, a small act of normalcy to keep herself grounded. But even as she carried out these small actions, her mind was a flurry of calculation. She was already planning her next moves, already thinking of how to turn their arrogance into their downfall. Robert entered the kitchen, his brow furrowed with concern, but he said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt her when she was in the middle of her thoughts. Instead, he set the tablet down and met her eyes. "They're back, aren't they?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, her gaze following the group of bikers as they slowed to a stop near the end of the driveway. "Same ones," she said softly, but there was no mistaking the coldness in her tone. "But this time, they're here for more than just a look." Her eyes flicked briefly to Robert, who was now standing beside her, watching the bikers with a wary expression. "They'll try to force our hand. It's not just about the ranch anymore. It's about power." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "I know. They've been testing us for weeks, watching us, waiting for us to crack." He paused, clearly wrestling with the decision he knew was coming. "We could just sell, move away, start fresh, let them have what they want. We're not getting any younger." Victoria turned to him, her face softening for a brief moment. "I know you want to protect this family," she said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "But this ranch, it's not just land, Robert. It's everything. It's our history, our future. If we give it up to them, we lose more than just the land. We lose everything." Robert looked down, clearly torn. He had always trusted her judgment, but this was different. The bikers weren't just a nuisance anymore. They were a threat, one that could tear apart everything they had worked so hard to build. He knew that Victoria was right. Selling out would only make them stronger, but at the same time, the risks seemed so high. "What if we can't stop them?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. "What if they come for us anyway?" Victoria gave him a reassuring smile, though there was little warmth in it. "If they come for us, we fight. If they think they can walk all over us, they're wrong." She turned back toward the window, her gaze fixed on the bikers who had now dismounted and were making their way toward the porch. It's time to show them why they made a mistake. The front door opened and Victoria stepped out onto the porch, the heat of the day already beginning to seep into the air. She stood tall, her posture relaxed but purposeful, like someone who had seen it all before. Romano, leading the charge, walked toward her with his usual arrogance, his two enforcers trailing behind. As he approached, he flashed that practiced smile, the one that he used to get what he wanted, to manipulate and control. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that Victoria knew all too well. "Mrs. Kingsley," Romano said, his voice dripping with false charm, "I must say, it's a beautiful morning for a ride. The air's clear, the sun's shining. Just perfect for a little business, don't you think?" Victoria smiled back, but it was a smile that held no warmth, no kindness. "It's a private ranch, Mr. Romano," she replied coolly, her voice as steady as ever, "and you're trespassing." Romano's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took a step closer. "I'm not here for trouble, Mrs. Kingsley. I'm here with an offer. You see, my organization has plans for this land. Big plans. Plans that could benefit you and your husband." He motioned vaguely behind him, as if the offer was something he could easily deliver. "I'm offering you $2 million. That's more than your property is worth, more than anyone else would offer you." Victoria's expression remained unchanged. She didn't flinch at the number, didn't let it faze her. "We're not interested," she said simply. The words were like a barrier, cutting off the conversation before it could go any further. Romano's smile slipped again, his patience clearly beginning to wear thin. "You don't understand, Mrs. Kingsley," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Things are changing around here. People who don't adapt get left behind. It's just the way things work." He stepped a little closer, trying to close the gap between them, his two enforcers flanking him on either side. Victoria didn't move an inch. She was a rock, unyielding. "I'm offering you a way forward, but it won't last forever. I need an answer in 3 days," Romano said, his tone now one of finality, as if the decision had already been made. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card and holding it out toward her. "Take the offer. It's fair. It's generous." Victoria's hand didn't move toward the card. She stood there, assessing the situation, reading the room. She could feel the eyes of Romano's enforcers on her, watching for any sign of weakness. They thought they had her, thought they could intimidate her into submission. But she was already 3 steps ahead. She allowed a brief, almost imperceptible tremor to pass through her hand as she reached for the card, giving them exactly what they wanted. Just a little sign of vulnerability. They needed to believe they were winning. Let them think they had the upper hand. It would make the next move that much sweeter. With the card in her hand, Victoria stepped back, letting her posture shift ever so slightly. Her expression hardened, and for just a moment the mask slipped, revealing the woman behind the rancher's wife. "I'll think it over, Mr. Romano," she said, her voice even, unshaken, "but don't expect an answer you want." She turned on her heel, heading back toward the house, leaving Romano standing there, his smile now gone, replaced with the frustration of a man who had just realized he was dealing with something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. As Victoria walked back into the house, she didn't look back. She knew the bikers would be watching her every move, waiting for a sign of fear. But they wouldn't find it, not from her, not now. Not ever. They had underestimated her, and that would be their undoing. The game was on, and Victoria was already prepared to play her hand. The moment Romano and his men left, Victoria knew it wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence in the wake of their departure heavier than any noise the motorcycles had made. Victoria stood at the window, watching the dust settle as the last of the bikes disappeared into the distance. She didn't need to turn around to know Robert was there. She could feel his eyes on her, filled with concern, but she couldn't afford to let that worry seep into her thoughts. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. Robert's footsteps were soft on the hardwood floor, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. "Vicky, are you sure we can't just sell?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with both weariness and a hint of fear. He had lived through enough to know what these bikers were capable of, but he wasn't trained to deal with the kind of danger they posed. He had spent his life on this land, working the soil, raising cattle, tending to crops. He had always been a man of the earth, not a man of the shadows. And now he was being dragged into a fight he never expected. Victoria finally turned to face him, her eyes steady and calm. She could see the doubt in his expression, the lines of worry etched deep on his face, but she didn't flinch. "Selling isn't an option," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "If we sell now, we're handing them everything. We're giving them control of this entire region." She walked toward him, her boots clicking softly against the floor. "I can't do that, and neither can you." Robert didn't respond at first. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "But what if we can't stop them, Vicky? What if they come for us anyway?" His voice was barely above a whisper, a soft plea for reassurance that he knew deep down she couldn't give. Victoria stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. She placed a hand on his arm, grounding him with her touch. "If we sell, they win," she said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. "This ranch, it's more than just land. It's our legacy, our future. And if we let them take it, we lose everything. The land, the freedom, everything we've worked for." Robert looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something, anything that would give him the strength to face what was coming. He had always trusted her, but this was different. This wasn't just a bad deal with a neighbor or a simple dispute over land. This was a war, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to fight it. Victoria saw the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty that only came from a man who was faced with a choice that could change everything. She understood it, she had felt it herself, but she also knew that sometimes the only way to protect what you loved was to fight for it. "We're not running, Robert," she said firmly, "and we're not selling. If they want this ranch, they're going to have to take it from me." Robert's eyes softened, and for a moment she saw the man she had married, the man who had stood by her side for 10 years. He knew her better than anyone, and he knew what she was capable of. He had never questioned her strength, even when the weight of her past as a federal marshal had seemed like a ghost that hung between them. But now, that past was not something to be feared. It was the very thing that would keep them safe. "I know," he said, his voice steady now, as though he had finally made his peace with the decision. "But I can't lose you, Vicky." Victoria smiled, a small, tight smile that held more steel than warmth. "You won't," she said, "but you need to trust me. I've been preparing for this day for a long time. They've underestimated me, and that's their biggest mistake." With that, she turned toward the door. There was no more time for doubts, no more time for hesitation. The bikers would come again, and when they did, she would be ready. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It was about sending a message that no one, not even a gang as powerful as Devil's Mayhem, could cross her without facing the consequences. As Victoria stepped outside, the sun had risen higher in the sky, the heat beginning to bake the land around her. The air felt thick, heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. She walked across the porch, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. There was something about the land beneath her feet, something deep in her bones that made her feel connected to it. This ranch had been in Robert's family for generations, but it was hers too now. She had fought for it, lived on it, loved it, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The quiet was almost unnerving, the calm before the storm, but she didn't flinch. She could feel the presence of the bikers even before she saw them. It was a feeling she had learned to recognize over the years, the quiet tension that comes with being hunted. But she wasn't prey. She was the hunter, and she was ready. Across the field she saw the first bike appear on the horizon, its shape growing clearer as it neared the ranch. It was the same red Harley she had spotted earlier, the one with the amateur rider, the one that would make a critical mistake. The others followed, their engines growling louder with each passing second. 3 bikes, 3 riders, just like before. But this time there was no question in Victoria's mind. This wasn't just about intimidation. They were coming for something, and she was going to make them regret it. Victoria walked back inside, her movements deliberate and calm. She knew what she had to do. The bikers had been testing her for weeks, watching her every move, trying to find a way to break her. But they didn't know what she had learned in her years as a federal marshal. They didn't know the patience it took to wait for the perfect moment. And now that moment had come. "Robert," she said, turning to face him as he appeared in the doorway, "we need to get ready. They're coming, and this time they won't be leaving with what they want." She didn't wait for a response. The preparation had already begun. She had made her plans, set her traps. It was time to move. As the bikers drew closer, Victoria felt the rush of adrenaline begin to flood her veins. She wasn't just fighting for the ranch anymore. She was fighting for herself, for Robert, for everything they had built. The bikers would learn quickly that no amount of intimidation would break her. They had come to take what wasn't theirs, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. This wasn't just a ranch. This was her home, and she was going to protect it, no matter what it took. The first bike rolled onto the property, its rider slowly coming to a stop. Victoria stood at the edge of the porch, waiting. It was time for the game to begin. She wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. She was going to show them just how wrong they were about her. The hunt was on, and the ghost was ready to make her presence known. The day Romano and his men left, Victoria knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The bikers were getting too comfortable, too bold. It was only a matter of time before they made another move, and she had no intention of waiting idly by, hoping they'd lose interest. She had already seen enough of their operation to know they weren't just playing for land anymore. They were aiming for complete domination, and she wasn't about to let them have it. Victoria spent the rest of the day going over the details in her head, checking everything twice. She was methodical, systematic, like she had been trained to be during her time as a federal marshal. Every corner of the ranch was familiar to her, every path, every shadow, every potential hiding spot or place to make a stand. She knew the property like the back of her hand, and she was going to use that to her advantage. That night she slept lightly, barely resting as her mind ran through the possibilities. She knew that the bikers would strike again. They weren't going to wait 3 days. They wanted the ranch, and they wanted it now. They had shown their hand once. The next time, they would move faster, more aggressively. They weren't going to wait for an answer. They were going to take matters into their own hands, and when they did, they would regret underestimating her. As the sun began to rise the next morning, Victoria was already up, her eyes scanning the land beyond the ranch house, watching for any movement that would signal their approach. The air was still cool, the first light of dawn casting a soft glow over the fields, but there was an underlying tension in the air. It wasn't just the promise of a hot day ahead, it was the knowledge that danger was near, closer than it had ever been. Victoria moved through the house with practiced ease, her movements deliberate. She knew that she needed to be ready. She had prepared for this moment for years, and now the time had come to put everything into motion. Robert was still asleep, and Victoria allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection before the storm broke. She had always kept a part of herself hidden from Robert, the part of her that had once been a federal marshal, a part of her that had killed without hesitation, that had moved in shadows and knew how to make criminals disappear. He didn't need to know the full extent of her past. He only needed to know that she would protect him, protect their home, no matter what. But this was different. This wasn't just about protecting him or the ranch. It was about sending a message, one that these bikers wouldn't forget. The ranch was hers, and anyone who thought they could take it from her would face the consequences. By the time the sun had fully risen, Victoria was already in place, sitting quietly on the porch, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had mapped out every potential angle of attack, and she was waiting for the bikers to make their move. It wouldn't be long now. She could feel it. The tension in the air was building, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then she saw them. 3 motorcycles appeared in the distance, their engines roaring in the still morning air. Romano was leading the pack again, the same confident swagger in his movements, the same arrogant smile on his face as he made his way down the gravel road toward the ranch. Victoria didn't move. She remained seated, calm, composed, as though she were just another rancher's wife enjoying a quiet morning. But inside, she was ready. She had been waiting for this moment. Romano and his enforcers pulled up to the porch, stopping in front of her. Victoria didn't even look up at them as they dismounted, their boots crunching the gravel beneath their feet. Romano, ever the showman, strode forward with his usual confidence, his eyes scanning the property as if he were already imagining it as his own. His 2 enforcers, younger, tougher-looking, took up positions behind him, their eyes darting around, assessing the situation. But they had underestimated Victoria. They didn't know what she was capable of, and that would be their undoing. "Mrs. Kingsley," Romano called out, his voice smooth, almost friendly, but there was an edge to it, a sense of power he tried to project. "I trust you've had time to think it over. I believe we can come to an arrangement that benefits both of us." Victoria stood up slowly, her eyes still on Romano, but she didn't say a word. She let him finish speaking, watching as he tried to read her. She knew what he was expecting, an intimidated rancher's wife who would cave under pressure. but that wasn't who she was. "I've thought about it," she said at last, her voice even, her eyes steady. "And I've come to a decision." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting them believe they had won. "I'm not selling." Romano's smile faltered, just slightly, but it was enough to make her heart race with a quiet thrill. She had him. He hadn't expected that. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Kingsley," he said, his voice colder now, the charm slipping away. "You don't want to do this. We're offering you a deal that no one else would give you. You'll regret turning it down." Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "I've lived through worse than you, Mr. Romano," she said quietly, "and I've never regretted standing my ground, not once." Romano's face darkened, his patience clearly running out. "I don't think you understand how things work around here. This isn't just about the ranch. This is about the future, your future, and if you don't take the deal, you're going to make this much harder on yourself." Victoria took a step forward, her expression calm but deadly. "I've made my decision, and if you want this ranch, you'll have to take it from me." The air around them seemed to still, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Romano's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a tight line. He had underestimated her once, and now he was beginning to realize just how big of a mistake that had been. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card and holding it out toward her, a last attempt at negotiation. "Think it over. You have 3 days. After that, I'll be back to collect what's rightfully mine." Victoria took the card, her fingers brushing against his ever so slightly. But instead of taking it in the way he expected, she let it fall to the ground at her feet, watching as it landed in the dust. Romano's expression twisted with anger, but he didn't say anything. He simply turned and motioned for his men to get back on their bikes. Victoria stood there, watching them leave, her heart pounding in her chest. The first move had been made, and now the game was in full swing. Romano had underestimated her, just as she had known he would, and he was going to regret that mistake. She wasn't just a rancher's wife. She was something far more dangerous, something they had no way of understanding, and now she was going to make sure they learned that lesson the hard way. As the motorcycles disappeared down the road, Victoria turned back to the house, her mind already racing with the next steps. She had been patient, but the time for waiting was over. She was going to bring the fight to them, on her terms, and this time there would be no turning back. The trap had been set, and the ghost was ready to hunt. The day after Romano's latest attempt to intimidate Victoria passed in a blur, she knew one thing for certain: the bikers wouldn't back off. They had underestimated her once, and they were far from being done. Romano had made it clear that the situation wasn't going to end with just a business card and a few threats. She had expected that, and that was why she had spent the better part of the past few weeks preparing. The ranch was more than just land. It was a battlefield, and every inch of it had to be accounted for. Victoria knew they would strike again. The question was when, and she wasn't going to sit around waiting for them to make the first move. She needed to be proactive. The bikers were arrogant, reckless, and sure of their power, but they had overlooked something fundamental. They were still dealing with her, the ghost, the federal marshal who had brought down more criminals than anyone could count. The time for waiting was over. It was time to make the next move. Victoria had never been one for idle threats. She had always preferred action. That was what had kept her alive during her time as a federal marshal, and it was what was going to save her now. Her instincts told her that the bikers were going to make their next move soon, and when they did, she would be ready. The problem wasn't just the bikers themselves, it was the growing network that surrounded them. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces missing from the puzzle. The land, the strange behavior of the bikers, the whispers about weapons trafficking, all of it pointed to something far bigger than a simple land grab. Victoria had been trying to piece together the operation for days, but it wasn't until she received a phone call late that night that she finally got the confirmation she needed. It was Marshal Kane, a former partner from her days with the federal government. He had been following a trail of clues in his own investigation, and now their paths were crossing once more. His voice on the other end of the line was tight with urgency, the kind of voice that told her everything was about to escalate. "Vicky," he said, his voice low and strained, "I've got something. It's big, and it's connected to the bikers." There was a pause, as if he was weighing his words carefully. "They're not just moving weapons. They're running a full-blown operation, one that involves military-grade equipment, and it's connected to something even bigger than I thought." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She had known there was more to this than just the land, but this was the confirmation she needed. "What are we dealing with?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. "They're moving military-grade weapons, explosives, and possibly even larger items," Kane continued, "but that's not the worst of it. I've traced some of the shipments. They're using the land along Canyon Road as a major artery for transporting illegal goods, things that need to stay off the radar. It's not just guns or drugs, Vicky. They're bringing in stuff that's off the books, military tech, classified materials, and it's all going through Montana." Victoria's mind raced. This was bigger than she had anticipated. The bikers weren't just a gang anymore. They were a cog in a much larger machine, one that extended far beyond the reach of her quiet ranch. But she wasn't going to back down. She had already seen enough to know that whatever they were up to, it wasn't going to end without a fight. "Where are they moving it?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. Kane didn't hesitate. "Across the border," he said. "They're planning to move some of it into Canada. They've been buying up land in the area, land that has the perfect conditions for smuggling. No cell service in certain spots, no direct surveillance from law enforcement. It's perfect for their operations." Victoria's blood ran cold. She could already picture it, trucks filled with weapons and illegal materials making their way along those back roads, invisible to the outside world. And the worst part was, she knew exactly where they were going. The bikers weren't just trying to control the land for themselves, they were laying the foundation for something much larger, an operation that involved international weapons trafficking. And that meant one thing: the stakes had just gotten much higher. She knew she had to move quickly. The bikers were getting more brazen with each passing day. They thought they were untouchable, that they could just come in, take what they wanted, and leave without consequences. But they hadn't accounted for her, and they certainly hadn't accounted for the resources she had at her disposal now. Kane's information had given her a vital piece of the puzzle. "I'm going to need backup," she said, her voice firm. "We need to shut this down before it goes any further." "I've got your back, Vicky," Kane replied, his voice resolute. "I'll pull in some of the old team. We'll be ready." Victoria hung up the phone, her mind already working on the next phase of the plan. She needed to be patient, careful. The bikers were already making their move. They were just waiting for the right moment to strike. But Victoria knew how to play the waiting game. She had learned that skill during her years in the field, how to wait for the perfect moment, how to set the trap so that when they walked into it, there would be no way out. That morning, she went over the plans one last time. She had already mapped out every route the bikers would take to get to the warehouse where they were storing the illegal goods. She knew the best places to ambush them, the choke points, the areas where they would least expect an attack. She wasn't just going to play defense. She was going to go on the offensive, and she wasn't going to give them a single inch. But Victoria wasn't alone in this fight. Robert had been quieter than usual since she had told him what was going on. He was worried, of course. He had every right to be, but he had also seen what she was capable of. He wasn't going to run, not now, not when everything they had worked for was on the line. He had always trusted her instincts, and now he was ready to stand by her side. "I'll get the truck ready," Robert said that evening, his voice steady. "You'll need it. Whatever you're planning, I'm with you." Victoria smiled at him, the rare softness in her expression a stark contrast to the hardness that had settled in her eyes. "Thanks, Robert," she said quietly. "I couldn't do this without you." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria checked every corner of the ranch, every access point, every place where the bikers could try to make their move. She set up security cameras along the perimeter, positioned hidden traps in key locations, and made sure she had weapons stashed in places where they could be reached quickly. Her mind was sharp, her focus unbreakable. This wasn't just about defending her home anymore. This was about taking down an operation that threatened everything. Then, just as she had predicted, the bikers made their move. It was late in the evening when the first of their trucks rolled into the area. Victoria watched from the hidden vantage point, her heart racing as she saw them pull into the warehouse. This was it. She had prepared for this moment, and now she had to make her move. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced down at the screen. A message from Kane. "We're in position. You're clear to proceed." Victoria exhaled, a calm, steady breath that felt like it grounded her in the moment. She had worked too hard to let this slip through her fingers. The bikers had no idea what was coming. She gave Robert one last look, his eyes full of determination. He knew exactly what she was about to do, and he was ready. She turned toward the truck, the familiar weight of the rifle resting against her shoulder, her senses sharpening as she prepared to execute the plan. They were about to find out what it meant to go up against the ghost. The night before the bikers were supposed to make their move, Victoria stood in the barn, her eyes scanning over the tools she had laid out for the task ahead. Every inch of the property was covered. Every approach, every potential weak point had been accounted for. Her heartbeat in rhythm with the work she was doing, each action deliberate, precise. She wasn't just preparing for a fight, she was setting a stage for a confrontation they wouldn't forget. Robert had been silent all day, a quiet presence in the background as she moved with purpose, getting everything ready. The gravity of the situation had settled over them both, but Victoria knew that Robert had accepted her decision. This wasn't just about protecting their ranch. It was about surviving a threat bigger than anything they had ever encountered. The Devil's Mayhem MC wasn't just a bunch of bikers looking for land to conquer. They were the tip of the spear in a much larger operation, one that stretched far beyond Montana's borders. They were trafficking illegal weapons, moving materials that could change the balance of power, and it had to be stopped. Victoria knew that if the bikers managed to establish their operation here, it would be impossible to get rid of them. The corruption, the smuggling, the gun running, it would be woven into the very fabric of this place, and it would slowly poison everything they held dear. That was why there was no turning back. Robert walked into the barn, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He looked around at the makeshift preparations, ropes, tools, cans of gasoline, rifles, and a few other things he couldn't quite name, but knew were important, and his eyes met hers. The concern was still there, but now there was something else in his gaze: acceptance. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want the violence that was about to come, but he knew that this fight wasn't something they could run from. "Are you sure about this, Vicky?" he asked quietly. Victoria paused for a moment, her hand on the rifle, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She turned toward him, her face softening for a split second before she hardened once more. "They're not leaving here without a fight. I've spent too long in this battle, Robert, not to finish it." He nodded, stepping forward. "I'm with you, Vicky, every step of the way. Just promise me you'll come back." She smiled, a rare, fleeting moment of warmth. "I always do." They worked together through the night, checking, rechecking, and securing every possible point. Victoria set traps in places they might least expect, areas she knew would slow them down or catch them off guard. Her mind was a blur of calculations, of risks and consequences, but she kept her focus. There could be no mistakes. If she let one thing slip, the bikers would overrun everything, and she couldn't afford to lose. Not now, not ever. By morning, the first of the bikers arrived. Victoria was already in position, watching from a vantage point high above the land. She could see the dust rising in the distance, the unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines echoing through the air. She didn't flinch. Her heart rate didn't increase. She was ready. Romano was leading the charge again, his bike roaring down the road toward the ranch. This time, though, there was no bravado in his movements. There was only urgency. They had a plan, and they were about to put it into motion. But what they didn't realize was that Victoria had been waiting for them. Every moment they spent approaching her land was a step into her trap. Victoria's fingers tightened around the rifle. She knew what was coming. This was it, the showdown. She had thought about this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. She wasn't just defending the ranch anymore. She was standing against an empire of violence, and she wasn't going to let them win. Romano's bike slowed as he approached the ranch. He had to know something was off. The land was too quiet. There was no sound of the animals, no movement around the house, but it was all part of the plan. He thought he had her cornered. He thought he had her in check, but he hadn't seen the whole picture. When Romano dismounted, the ground seemed to hold its breath. His two enforcers followed, their movements cautious, their hands twitching toward their weapons. They had learned the hard way to be wary of Victoria. She had set this stage perfectly, and now it was time to play her part. Victoria stepped out from her position, her silhouette barely visible against the morning light. She wasn't armed to the teeth, at least not in the way they might have expected. Her rifle was slung casually across her back, her stance relaxed. She wasn't giving them the satisfaction of showing fear. Instead, she projected calm, confidence, control. Everything they thought they knew about her was about to crumble. Romano saw her, and for a moment his confident smirk faltered. He had underestimated her before, and now he was seeing the consequences of that mistake. "Mrs. Kingsley," he called out, his voice a little too eager, a little too forced. "I was hoping we could come to an agreement today. What do you say we make this easy?" Victoria didn't move. She didn't even blink. "I've already told you. I'm not selling." Romano's smile turned cold. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about the land anymore. This is about making sure you don't stand in my way. If you refuse me again, I'm not sure you'll walk away from this." Victoria's smile was slow to form, a chilling thing that made his men shift uneasily. "You've already made the mistake of underestimating me, Romano, and that's going to be the last mistake you make." Without another word, she reached for her rifle. The first shot rang out, but it wasn't aimed at them. It was a warning shot, one that split the silence, sending the two enforcers scrambling for cover. Romano's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief as he looked for the source of the shot. But there was no time for hesitation. The bikers were already on the move, trying to reach for their own weapons, but it was too late. Victoria moved like lightning, each step calculated, each action swift. She dropped to the ground, her rifle coming up with perfect precision. The second shot rang out, knocking the first enforcer off balance. He went down hard, his weapon slipping from his hand as he collapsed in the dirt. Romano's remaining enforcer tried to make a move, but it was a mistake. A third shot, and he was disarmed, his gun falling uselessly to the ground. Romano, seeing his men fall, finally regained some composure. "You think you've won?" he shouted, but his voice was a little too shaky. "No," Victoria replied, her voice calm, almost bored. "But you're about to learn something about who you're dealing with." She gestured for Robert, who had appeared beside her, calm and resolute as always. With one motion, Robert threw a rope around the second enforcer, tying him up with the precision of someone who had worked on ranches all his life. Romano stood there, staring, his mind scrambling for a way out. But it was already too late. Victoria's trap had closed, and now all he could do was watch as the bikers realized they had been outsmarted, outplayed, and outclassed. Victoria didn't waste time with threats anymore. She knew what had to happen next. She turned to Robert, a nod exchanged between them, silent, knowing. They had already planned this out. It wasn't just about taking control of the ranch anymore. It was about ending the bikers' reign of terror before it could spread further. They had to make sure Romano and his men understood that their operation had been destroyed. And it wasn't just because of the ranch. It was because the ghost had returned. The bikers were disarmed and bound, their weapons taken. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the quiet of the ranch was broken only by the wind in the trees and the soft crackle of a fire Victoria had started. The bikers were going nowhere, and Romano, once so sure of his power, was now reduced to nothing more than a prisoner on the very land he thought he could take. "Now," Victoria said, her voice smooth and confident, "we finish this." Victoria had never been one to celebrate a victory prematurely, but as she stood in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation with Romano and his men, a rare sense of satisfaction crept into her chest. The bikers were bound, their weapons confiscated, their pride shattered. She knew that it wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to take a breath. It had been a long time since she'd faced down an enemy like this one. Romano and his men had come to her ranch thinking they could intimidate her, take control, force her into submission. They thought they were the predators, but in the end, they had underestimated the one thing that had always made her different, her resolve. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, and for a moment, Victoria allowed herself to simply look at the ranch. It was quiet now, calm. The cows grazed peacefully in the distance, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded on the other side of the property. It was moments like this that made her appreciate the land, the peace, the solitude. But she couldn't let herself linger too long in these fleeting moments of peace. She had more pressing matters to deal with. Romano might be contained for now, but the true threat was still out there, lingering just beyond the horizon. Victoria turned to Robert, who had been standing silently beside her throughout the entire ordeal. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the toll that the constant tension had taken on him. He had always been the calm one, the one who kept things together, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. But she knew this had shaken him. Not just the bikers or the danger to their ranch, but the reality of what they were up against. This was bigger than anything they could have anticipated. It was an operation that spanned far beyond Montana, and there was no way to predict what the bikers, or the people they were working for, might do next. "Robert, we can't let them get away with this," Victoria said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She looked over at the two enforcers who were still tied up, their eyes wide with fear. Romano wasn't far behind, but he was silent now, watching everything unfold with a mix of disbelief and dread. "We need to know who's really behind this, who's pulling the strings." Robert nodded slowly, his hand brushing over his face as he exhaled deeply. "I know, Vicky, I know. But how far does this go? How much more do we have to deal with before this ends?" Victoria gave him a small, reassuring smile, though her eyes remained sharp. "It ends when we make it end, Robert, and we'll make it end on our terms." She moved toward the bikers, her presence commanding even in the silence. Romano and his men were still processing what had just happened, still trying to make sense of how a woman they had thought of as nothing more than a rancher's wife had turned the tables so completely. Victoria could see the disbelief in their eyes, but there was also something else there, something more dangerous. It was the same look she had seen in the eyes of countless criminals throughout her career, the look of someone who had been caught off guard and was now calculating their next move, looking for a way to regain control. "You've lost, Romano," Victoria said, her voice cold but steady. "You thought you could come in here and take what you wanted, but you're wrong. You've underestimated me, and that's a mistake you won't get to make again." Romano finally spoke, his voice low and filled with venom. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you've got the upper hand, but you have no idea what you've just stepped into. You think this is over? You're just getting started. My people, the ones who run this operation, they'll come for you. They'll come for all of you. You won't stop this." Victoria's gaze remained unwavering. "I've stopped worse than you, Romano, and when your people come, they'll find the same thing you found here. A woman who doesn't back down. A woman who will fight for what's hers." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "You're done, and so is your operation." There was a brief flicker of something, fear perhaps, behind Romano's eyes, but it quickly faded as he straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of authority. He was a man who was used to controlling situations, to calling the shots, and the fact that he was bound and helpless in front of her clearly grated on his pride. But it was too late. The game had already been decided. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you can just take us down and walk away without consequences? There's always a bigger game at play, and you're just a pawn, Victoria. You're all just pawns." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she crouched down in front of him. "I'm no pawn. I'm the one who calls the shots, and right now you're out of moves." She stood up, her hand brushing against her side where she had hidden a small device earlier. "I've already sent a message, and help is on the way." Romano's expression darkened as the realization hit him. "You think you can just keep us here? Think again." Victoria didn't respond. She turned to Robert, who was already moving toward the truck to load up the bikers. There would be no more talking. Romano and his men were done. They had crossed a line, and now it was time to show them just how far they had fallen. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Victoria had already contacted Kane and the team he had assembled, and now the entire ranch was on alert. The bikers might be contained for the moment, but there was still work to be done. The warehouse where the bikers had been storing their illicit goods was still in play, and Victoria knew that if she didn't move quickly, it wouldn't be long before their operation would be up and running again. She couldn't allow that. Kane and his team arrived just as night was beginning to fall, the sounds of their vehicles rumbling over the dirt road signaling their arrival. Victoria greeted them at the gates, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she led them toward the warehouse. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to surge through her veins again, the familiar feeling of being on the cusp of something big, something dangerous. But this time, it wasn't just about taking down criminals, it was about taking down an empire. "Everything's in place," Victoria said to Kane as he stepped out of the truck. "The bikers are bound and ready for transport. We need to get to the warehouse before they have a chance to recover." Kane nodded, his expression serious. "We'll move quickly. We don't have much time. If they have backup, it's coming soon. We can't let them regroup." Victoria led them toward the warehouse, her steps purposeful and measured. As they approached, she could see the dim light coming from the windows, evidence of their continued operation despite their setbacks. It was clear that Romano and his men hadn't given up. But they were about to find out that Victoria wasn't the kind of woman to be intimidated into submission. She had built this moment, step by step, and now it was time for the final act. The team moved in quickly, clearing the perimeter and preparing for the breach. Victoria's heart was steady, her breathing even. This wasn't the first time she had gone in to neutralize a threat, but this time it felt personal. It wasn't just about the operation anymore. It was about everything she had worked for, her family, her ranch, her future. And it was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could come into her life and take whatever they wanted. As the team moved through the warehouse, securing each room, Victoria found herself at the back, where the goods had been stored. She had seen the military-grade weapons, the explosives, the materials that had no place being in the hands of criminals, and now she was ready to make sure they were gone for good. The operation would be shut down, and with it, the bikers' reign of terror would come to an end. Victoria didn't hesitate. She reached for the control panel, flipping the switches and powering down the equipment. As the lights flickered and the systems went dark, she heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. Kane had caught up with her, a look of approval in his eyes. "We're done here," Victoria said, her voice cold but satisfied. Kane nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's over." But Victoria knew better. It wasn't over yet. There were still the higher-ups to deal with, the ones who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. But for now, she could take a breath. She had won, and that was all that mattered.